We hold these truths to be self-evident. Corporations are not people. Money is not speech. This is not a Christian nation. And the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. Welcome to Disorderly Conduct.
All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of Disorderly Conduct. We are pleased to have you guys back. We're excited because we're going to be talking about American imperialism, one of my favorite topics. In light of the recent takeover of Venezuela, which is a lovely reminder of American history and all the countries that we tend to fuck up, this will be fun. I'm Jesse, IT guy by day, a concerned citizen, 24 hours, activist at night, I guess. And I'm just here trying to fight against fascism and joined by my colleagues if they want to introduce themselves.
I was wondering why nobody would tell me what the topic was, and I do apologize today. I'm sick. I'm Bobby, I'm a litigator and activist at heart, and this is going to be one hell of a topic.
Hey, I'm Joey. I'm a retired Green Beret after 21 years and spent in special ops, co-founder of Mob, and as everyone else has indicated, concerned citizen. I want to figure out what we can do about this and tie what we're seeing now to the history of this planet.
I'm Fingers, 30-year working musician, accountant by day, mature historian whenever I get a chance to read, concerned citizen 24/7, and I just bought a pitchfork.
Yeah, we're gonna need those. All right, so today is about the history of American imperialism, and I want to lead right up into Venezuela and give our thoughts about Venezuela, what's going on, and what we predict. I do want to take the first 20 minutes or so to give this kind of narrative throughout American history so that we all have context about this stuff, because I don't think a lot of people really understand American imperialism. I think when people think of American imperialism, I think they tend to think of either the Gilded Age or more modern stuff, but I don't think they understand how it evolved, where it came from, and how we got to where we are today. So I wanted to start off kind of giving this narrative, and you guys can, interrupt whatever you want, throw something in. Maybe I'll stop and we'll, discuss our thoughts about these types of things. But we're going to go all the way back to the founding, literally all the way back to 1776. And we're going to talk about the American Revolution and how this really kind of shifted things. At the creation, obviously, of the Constitution, America was a very young nation. They were very unsure of themselves and were still finding their footing, what kind of institutions and nation they wanted to be. At the very beginning, when George Washington was elected for his first 2 terms, one of the biggest concepts, one of the biggest issues of the day, if you will, was the French Revolution. And the French Revolution sharply divided people in America. The Federalists saw it as chaos, and the Democratic Republic, or the Republican Democrats, saw it as a continuation of the spirit of the revolution. And these sides kind of didn't really agree on how to take on the revolution. The reason why it's important is because we have to understand that at this time the world started to shift away from monarchy, and the traditional monarchy was being challenged. The American Revolution was arguably one of the first revolutions to use Age of Enlightenment theories to kind of push off monarchical power. And this started to spread. France felt the same, and it kind of kept going on from there. And what's interesting is, in the early 1800s, you saw a lot of Latin American countries actually fight for independence. Between 1815 to 1825, almost every single Latin American country starts declaring independence. And you see European power diminish in the colonies and start shifting away. It's around this time that James Monroe does something that we're going to be talking about later on called the Monroe Doctrine. And the Monroe Doctrine was really more of a statement. It was more of a statement because the United States didn't have, one, that much power to really influence, and two, they didn't want to. They didn't have the ability to get involved in foreign affairs. So James Monroe basically was saying, because of the independence that's happening in Latin America, because of the American young country that we are, we want to establish the idea that America belongs to us and Europe should stay out. Is essentially what the Monroe Doctrine was. Europe should not get involved in us anymore. We are now breaking away from old monarchies. We are declaring independence as separate continents, and y'all should fuck off. All right, America is for the Western Hemisphere, and don't fuck with us, essentially. But the issue is that there is no real way to actually implement this. right? The only reason why it kind of worked was because actually the British Empire saw it as beneficial to them because they had already lost the Americas. Now their enemies were losing colonies. Spain was losing colonies, France was losing colonies, and it was great for Britain. Britain's like, you know what? We dealt with this 50 years ago. Now is your guys' turn, and we're going to let this happen. And this, I would argue, is the first phase of the American, imperialism, if you will. This would shift, obviously, as time progressed. After the Civil War, the United States had a standing army. And once they conquered the continental United States from coast to coast in the 1880s, America wanted to flex its powers and took a page out of these books. Using the justification of the Monroe Doctrine, saying Europe should stay out of it, they almost reinterpreted it under Theodore Roosevelt, where they started to say, not only should Europe be out of it, we should be into it. And in the 1890s, we have the Spanish-American War, where America starts to change this imperialistic idea that we conquered the continental United States. We have a military that we've been building upon because of the Civil War, and Europe is losing power. Monarchies are dropping. They're losing their power. They're losing their colonies. They're shifting actually to Africa, technically. A shout out to Leopold, who massacred 10 million Africans for rubber. But that's where that comes from, right? And now we come into the 20th century. And in the 20th century, we see America really start fucking shit up in Latin America, using excuses like American exceptionalism, eugenics, Monroe Doctrine, and even using justification from companies like United Fruit Company to commission the U.S. government and to go into different countries to overthrow, topple governments, and so on and so forth. And this leads obviously directly up until the Great Depression, where America starts to kind of be a little bit more isolated. This, let me pause right here and see what you guys think so far. Any thoughts? Anything you guys want to throw in?
Well, I see why you didn't share your topic. What a fucking banger. Jump too far ahead, but yeah, no, it leads right up until our invasion of Venezuela, right? It's really weird. Leads right up to. And also just the spread of democracy, according to Trump, at the end of a gun. I mean, and then this ties so intricately into the immigration conversation. Kudos to you. Like, y'all take it.
I think for me, there's so many things that resonate and, history rhyming, Spanish-American War and Remember the Maine, which is sketchy because we don't actually know. And I'm not sure if history has rendered a verdict on whether the Maine was actually blown up by the Spanish or not. And the creation of reasons to go in and take these places. And there's just little more like bits of trivia that always occur to me about how this stuff is woven into American fabric. I mean, the reason why Marines have the nickname of Leathernecks is because we acquired the Philippines as part of the Spanish-American War. And while they were there trying to suppress the native Filipinos, they found out that they needed protection from the knives of the Filipinos and started wearing a leather piece around their neck to protect them. And so the Marines became Leathernecks.
And fingers, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I don't want to ruin your story, but I do recall seeing a video on your page about Operation Just Cause.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we'll get there. I don't want to.
Yeah.
I mean, that's when we get to Venezuela, like they're not even trying to be inventive anymore. It's just like.
But is it just cause because it is a just cause, or is it just because?
Yeah. That was a lot of what we made the same joke at the time, for sure.
So I think that's such a good frame for going into this topic, right? Because now it's interesting, right? I think usually when I think of imperialism, I'm mostly thinking in terms of colonialism. And I think we are, as a byproduct of, the intersection of the Industrial Revolution and the success, right? Well, the economic success that brought the United States from World War II. And our imperialism looks like it's military. Yeah.
I mean, that is such a good point. So I'm kind of going over this very quickly because I'm trying to get to a point, but you bring up a very good point that in the 1880s, that is actually when America became an economic power, like a contender on the world stage for superpower, was the 1890s because of the Industrial Revolution. And with that economic power, with the Monroe Doctrine, with the military being able to sustain this idea of expansion, now America goes on the offensive. They challenge the Spanish Empire. They take over Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam. The Philippines is the big one. That's where the Filipino War comes into play. One thing I do want to point out is that American imperialism changes over time. It has stages, right? In the very, very, very beginning, America said, no, we're not going to do this. Then they said, you can't do this here. Then they said, now that you don't have the power we do, you can't do it, but now we're going to do it. And then now we get into the 1940s, right? Obviously, World War II happens. And one of the things that really shifted in World War II was something called proto-pointillism. All right, proto-pointillism really was inspired because of the Pacific War with General MacArthur. And what we see essentially is America is island hopping. And they realize that they don't necessarily need to control land to have influence, but points of bases and forward points in order to exert influence. And this is extremely influential into post World War II American imperialism, because no longer does America feel that it needs to take a page out of the fallen empires. That, listen, World War I officially ended. The rule of monarchs and republics and communism started to take over. You ready? And that's also, I would argue that World War II also is a kind of a shedding off of, monarchical power and a playing with like fascism and so on. But yeah, go ahead, Bobby.
Let me ask you a question. So when you talk about the difference, like Joey had mentioned, between colonialism and imperialism, right? I feel like you're touching on something that is essentially a significant difference. The control of a territory versus the extraction of wealth and resources, right? So colonialism, your colony of us. Well, that was no longer popular, right? But just like right now with Venezuela, I've said this over and over again. You cannot proffer the story that we are liberating the Venezuelan people and then extract resources and wealth from their nation. Because imperialism is not liberation. 10%. And so that's sort of like the transition from colonialism to imperialism. Like you said, the idea, the fact that people cannot look at that and call it what it is today is mind blowing, honestly.
So I've got another point, right? You said something there, Bobby, that I think we got to stop for. It was no longer popular, right? But what's always popular? National security and safety. And so when we talk about, and what you're talking about, these forward operating bases, right? What that gives us the ability to do, as we say in the military, is to be able to project combat power. Because as we know, strategy is largely a matter of logistics. If I can't get my troops, can't get my material to you, then I have no power, right? And so, and of course, and as you know, and I think this kind of comes into play in Europe, right? They're fighting each other because there's no ocean between them. They also lack the ability to project combat power, right? And so we figure this out. We go, okay, well, we never really had colonies outside the United States, and it's not popular, right? People are revolting all over the place. But what if we said, we're going to come in there and we're going to help you stabilize? We're going to teach you how to be like us. That's where it changed.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean, when TR was Secretary of the Navy, he was a big fan of the book was put out around that time, Alfred Thayer Mann, and he created this concept of controlling the buffer space, which is just as you say, Joey, right? It's like controlling the oceans, controlling the space and having buffer space between you and your enemies. It's a strategic advantage. And like you said, the countries in Europe do not have the ability to control their buffer space. But part of the reason why England is still England, because they had some buffer space to protect themselves, from France to a degree. Part of the reason Ireland is still Ireland is because they have a little bit of buffer space to protect themselves from England. I mean, less so now.
And they're just mean as hell.
But historically so, right? The thing that sticks to me or like that I want to do is flip it on its head, because when I think of colonialism, I think that as explicitly extractive. Like the reason we have colonies is to go there and get resources that benefit the homeland. And imperialism is like, no, we're going to go plant our flag so we can brag that the sun never sets on the Union Jack or something like that. So for me, they're flipped in my mind. It's like we forego imperialism in terms of like, hey, this is our territory as long as we can get out of it what we want. And I know, Jesse, you and I are both fans of Daniel Immerwahr's book, How to Hide an Empire. There's also a book, I don't know if you guys have ever read it. It's a little pulp, but it's called Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
Yeah.
And he's talking about how, like specifically how corporatism and how exploitation works in the modern world. So we're not quite there yet in the narrative, but it's a good read for people. It's a little conspiracy minded. I'm not sure I give every word he writes credit, but it's interesting to see the mechanics of what he's talking about. It's like, oh, we're going to come in and help you because you guys need power. So you need a hydroelectric plant, which means you need a dam. And guess what? I just happen to know a company from the US, which will be happy to come in and build your dam. And oh, by the way, this is going to be $200 million that your taxpayers have to pay.
Yeah.
And oh, by the way,
China,
the
anyone?
contractor is my best.
So these are all phenomenal points, and I want to keep building on them. There is also one thing I do want to point out as well, is that the justification for imperialism or colonialism has changed over time, right? Again, originally it was frowned upon, then it was don't get into our backyard, then it is our backyard, then it was manifest destiny and eugenics, right? And these are the justifications that American exceptionalism demands American expansion, right? It is our manifest destiny to fulfill this. Very similar to what Europeans thought for centuries.
To Zionism.
Yeah, absolutely. And we see this change post World War II. And where we see this change is in two ways. Number one, in how America exerts foreign influence. And it really is pointillism. This idea that we don't need to control land, but we need to exert influence by bases and forward military points. Right? And so what America does is use the second point that I'm going to make as justification for pointillism, and that is communism in the Cold War. So the United States uses communism in the combating of the spread of communism as an excuse to exert its superpower dominance across the globe. And in the next 80 years, under NATO and under various reasons, establish over 800 military and influential points across the globe that we have today. And the last point that this really changes is 9/11. And 9/11 sees America's imperialism change yet again from not just pointillism in combating the commies, but now terrorism. Terrorism becomes a very key word at how the United States uses imperialism and uses its power to get its desired outcome. It's what we experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, and is specifically what we are experiencing now in Venezuela with narco terrorism as the justification for taking down Venezuela. So there's this progression throughout American history that we see of, again, from the very beginning, progressing by different causes, different justifications the United States uses to exert its imperial power overseas to bring us to where we are today when it comes to terrorism. And I really want to know your guys' thoughts.
That's sort of the flex point that you're talking about, right? And I see him already like, so let's go ahead and flip that one over, shall we? But also, I mean, I would like touch on, the NDAA and like the constitutional limits of this. But I mean, clearly, I think this is like squarely in his ball.
Yeah, I think I think those are brilliant inflection points, right? And it's very interesting too. Even if you look at Iran, Operation Ajax, right? Just another maybe step ahead of that, where the justification for us going in there to topple them was communism. If we don't do something, the communists are going to help them. They're going to turn to the Soviets, right? And that's our chief ally at the time, or adversary at the time, right? And so I don't know. And then Al Qaeda really kind of did a number, right? Because before it was about a strategic location, right? Having a base here because this is where the enemy's at. This is where we project power from. Al Qaeda is the first organization we really kind of see come on the modern stage that's not trying to hold territory, right? They're just conducting. And so then our counter to that, right? And it's deeply unpopular with security-minded Americans. It's deeply unpopular, this concept of terrorism, but it is a direct response to Al Qaeda. And it was kind of by necessity, right? They're threatening to have cells here. They've got cells in Canada. They're conducting attacks against us in the Middle East, where we've got forward deployed troops. They're conducting attacks in France, right? And so these things are happening, and it's like, well, how do we as an international community handle this, right? And it kind of, and by the way, just real quick, and this will be my final point before I turn over to you guys. This is a lesson that we learned. So you have what we call the JIM environment, a joint interagency international, I don't know, something like that. I can't remember the exact thing, but it's us being able to work in our service, right? Service to service, nation to nation, agency to nation, right? So being able to kind of coordinate across these domains. And the designation, or really the focus on terrorism as something we target that doesn't have a pinpointable geographic location, right? We couldn't even find bin Laden for the longest, right? Then it creates this kind of idea that, hey, we need an international coalition, right? And the GWOT kicks off, and I've seen Polish troops, Canadian troops, right? UN troops all over the place in both Iraq and Afghanistan, because we're combating terrorism now in the form of Al-Qaeda. I'm interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. One of the things about 9/11 is it got the American people to sign off for the first time on perpetual war, right? It's also the first time we declared war on a tactic. We're not declaring war on a specific people. We declared war on a tactic, which just tells you it's intended as an excuse. Go ahead, Bobby. I see you like.
Well, yeah, but here's the thing, because that's what you hear. And I had a question for Joey about some of that, because even with Venezuela, and don't get me wrong, Obama did drone strikes that were not authorized by Congress as well. But commonly you hear the excuse that, oh, well, we declared war on terrorism. But that's not exactly true, right? The Patriot Act, like there were congressional authorizations of the use of force on the persons or countries responsible for 9/11. So they're not exactly as amorphous as people want to say with terrorism. And even when you talk about the word terrorism, it means something under the law. You don't get to just be like terrorist, whatever. Just like you don't get to jump in front of a moving car and shoot a woman in the face 3 fucking times. Okay. I mean, and that's just the way it is. And people will say this over and over again, like, no, actually, number one, regardless of who you think perpetrated or allowed 9/11 to happen, the United States was attacked, and our president was allowed to respond. It is congruent with international law and domestic law, 110%, and constitutional law, period. Right? And we didn't just say, like, oh, terrorism. Anybody I say is a terrorist, I get to go strike. That's not the particulars of what was established, but it is what you hear repeated over and over again and used to disregard the law. Apparently, he's only constrained by his own morality.
Yeah. Sorry if I may. So to the point, Bobby, that's one of the things, one of my biggest disappointments in Obama was there was so much expansion of executive power.
Patriot Act, my God.
Specifically, as communicated by Rahm Emanuel, they not only took all of the powers that Bush had, but claimed more. And one of them was, if you're an American citizen who's an enemy combatant, I have the right to kill you anywhere on the planet with a robot. And the only thing that designates you as an enemy combatant is I, the president, have said, you are an enemy combatant. Go forth and sin some more so I can kill you. I do also at this point, sorry, I want to circle back to a point you made earlier, Jesse, to connect some dots. You mentioned that the Gilded Age is the first time the U.S. became economically available to project force outward. And what jumps to my mind is the Gilded Age was also the first time we had really massive accumulations of wealth and huge wealth inequality. And I mean, it just occurs to me when you mention the time frame, I think that there's definitely some connective tissue there, and obviously we see that now with wealth inequality. And I think part of the reason that I make this point, obviously wealth inequality is my big enemy, but I think part of the reason, and people need to understand when we talk about wealth inequality and the threats to the working class, it's not just that you're going to have an economically hard life. It's if you don't rein this in, your children's future is dying in wars between billionaires.
So there's two things I want to mention. I want to mention very quickly, so I don't forget, that America has had experience in testing with using terrorism in war against a tactic, like you said, Fingers. In the experience that they derive it from is the war on drugs in the Cold War, right? We declared war on an ideology and we declared war on a substance, right? We declared war on the usage of a substance. And these were prototypes, if you will, that would eventually lead up to us being able to declare war on a tactic called terrorism, right? Legitimate or not, right? It is used for justification. I want to also mention another thing that you're talking about, the Gilded Age. It's when the Pendleton Act was passed in the 1880s, I believe. No, sorry, 1870s. It was after the assassination of James A. Garfield. The Pendleton Act specifically said that no longer could money be donated directly to a presidential candidate, right? So this changed the laws of campaign financing and politics as it came to funding campaigns and whatnot, right? What we see is going up into the 1890s, we see the Republican Party started the RNC under a guy named Mark Hanna for the William McKinley election at this time. And we see a lot of businesses start to pour money into the RNC. And then 10 years later in 1905, the DNC is created. And at the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt, he speaks very often about the threat of money in politics, the threat of business, of the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Standard Oils in politics and how it needs to be addressed, which is where we get the Tillman Act in 1911. So there is a direct link, exactly what you're talking about, Fingers, between a legitimate concern in politics at the turn of the 20th century, where even Theodore Roosevelt is in his State of the Union addresses, he is giving warning that we need to curb money in politics because it is affecting the U.S. government, not just domestically, but foreignly. And this coming from the master of imperialism himself, who rode on horseback, right? Who was, what was it? Speak soft, but walk with a big stick, right?
Yeah, speak softly. It's supposedly an African proverb. Also, just trivia note, like he and Mark Hanna hated each other.
They did, yeah.
It was a fluke of history that became president because he was a problem and like an upstart and a troublemaker within the RNC because he had this progressive ideas. Well, what do you do when you have a popular troublemaker? You park him somewhere where he can't do anything, i.e. the vice presidency. And then, an anarchist took care of elevating him to the presidency.
Absolutely. And I think that's a very good point that you're making. So I want to make those 2 points that Fingers is spot on, that the rise of economic power within the United States absolutely influenced its foreign policy, and that America had practice with declaring war on terrorism tactics with the war on drugs in the Cold War.
Just one last tag on point, because I don't want people to conflate this. Like, America became economically viable, economically powerful. That prosperity did not spread to the working class, folks. That's much like today when people will tell you, oh, the economy is booming, the stock market is up. It's like, yes, for the asset class, if you own stuff, then you're doing well. But if you work for a living, not so much.
Yeah. So I think one of the valuable points to make here is that you guys do mention, declaring war on a tactic, but I think again, and by the way, I think now I remember it's joint inter-service, interagency, multinational. That's what the GIM environment is, right? So you can kind of see, right? So anyway, but I think that we can't miss the point that the issue is not declaring war on a substance or declaring, but it's what the focus has to become. If you take it maybe a layer deeper, what we're trying to accomplish by doing that, right? And more specifically, I think more poignantly, what powers we're allowing ourselves to have with that justification, right?
100%.
Okay, we'll declare a war on drugs, right? And we'll project combat power into another country, right? Into their sovereign state. And in order to do that, here's how we justify it, right? This is the justification we need. We do the same thing with the war on terror. We do the same thing with, the CIA Operation Ajax in Iran, right, in the 50s. So, I mean, it's just connecting those dots, I think, is important. Over.
Bobby, you're muted.
That was going to be more, I guess, really honestly, more of a question because, when you hear about the war on drugs, obviously we think about the effects on different communities within the United States, domestic effects. But what, sort of extrinsic international powers, did they connect directly to that? Because now I know Jesse, the historian, and clearly you probably have plenty of experience in this, Joey. Because what's happening now is literally just the declaration that I can do whatever I want. I can say anybody has done anything and then do whatever I want in violation of international law. But the war on drugs, and I'm probably maybe a wee bit younger or maybe it's everybody here except for Jesse. What war powers, what emergency powers were activated with the war on drugs when you talk about external call?
Well, I think it's the precursor to what we're seeing today, right? The Venezuela thing.
But precursor, fine, but there was no explicit. You see what I'm asking you?
Precedent. I say precedent, right? If we can, right? And you notice we don't do it for a very long time after that, right? And we do it. We're interventionists nowadays. We don't do something like that, right? Where it's just almost entirely us going in and going after a personality. right? Just one guy in a sovereign state, not in a war zone, right? And not clandestinely. I'm not going to suggest that we haven't done clandestine operations, right? Just to, for the listener, there's a difference between covert and clandestine. Covert means, you know, something happened, but you don't know who did it. Clandestine means you don't even know something happened, right? You read a news story. Oh, guy has heart attack in a hotel room, but really that was a direct operation.
So, Bob, can you ask your question again? Because I think I have an answer, but I want to make sure I'm actually answering
Yeah,
correctly.
just like, for example, like right now, this narco terrorism, and we are literally, you know, invading, bombing, perpetrating acts of war against a sovereign nation, using sonic weapons. You see what I'm saying? But the war on drugs is more of an intrinsic. It was a domestic explanation. You see what I'm saying? Like there was no explicit, like, oh, war on drugs, we get to do X, Y, Z. Like a lot of our excursions into Latin America were not. It was not like an out and open. Hey, A connects to B. Then, but like right now, it's like, oh, we can do whatever we want to anybody once I decide that they're, you know, narco terrorists. Do you know what I mean? And my actual question was, you know, really honestly, am I missing something? Is there something I don't know about? And I understand you said precursor, and yeah, that explains enough for me. But I just want to make sure I wasn't missing an explicit link to the expansion or consolidation of emergency powers under the executive.
What I think of when you're talking about this, I just want to mention a few things that come to mind. Is the idea that it's obviously no secret that power in the executive has been aggregated over time, right? More and more powers has been given. Sometimes I would argue even unintentionally. Obviously, post World War II, America became the world police, and this is power given over to the executive. Now the president controls the military, active military all over the world at all times, 24/7, 365 days a year, every single year since World War II, right? And this is a huge expansion of power to the executive that no one really thinks about. No one really thinks of it that way, kind of thing. We just saw it as like, oh, well, the world's over and like we got to rebuild stuff. But there's so much more behind that too. And we see a lot of emergency war powers being given to presidents like Nixon in the 70s, right? Specifically because of the Vietnam War. And these powers, again, are aggregated time and time again. In 9/11, yet again, is done in things like the Patriot Act and things I would even argue like the creation of the DHS, right, is more power in the executive. The expansion of the NSA, 7 times more personnel in funding than the CIA, right, to domestically and foreignly spy on enemies and allies alike, including Congress itself. This expansion of power is continuously built upon with every new experience, with every new excuse in order to carry out the will. And here's the most nefarious part, in my opinion. It is the fact that a lot of these things are legitimate. And the legitimate concern, the legitimate issue, the legitimate topic is then used as justification for more power, for resources, for imperialism, essentially, right? Like terrorism is a real thing. We've seen 9/11. Everyone here knows about 9/11, right? And now it becomes a scapegoat. It becomes a wild card for the United States to just throw off and say, well, we're going to do this now because we have the terrorism card, so we can do this. And I think it's, and this kind of goes into another topic we can talk about later on, but this kind of gets into a loophole of constitutional rights that I think is antithetical to the very American ideals and principles themselves.
So a couple of things come to mind. One is that's part of the job of the citizenry, right? It's like when there seems to be a good justification to give up your rights is the point at which you need to be most vigilant and stick in your heels, because often when those rights are given away, they don't come back. I mean, especially like, I think we can see it around free speech, the desire to like shut people down. But, you know, as the point has been made in Supreme Court cases, speech that everybody agrees with doesn't need protection. Speech that everybody disagree with is the speech that needs protection, right? Just as an example. And so, you know, we've seen it, like we saw it through 9/11, you know, so many people just accepted, oh, they're going to record all of our phone calls, all of our voicemails, all of our text messages. The NSA is just going to keep that on file, and we're supposed to trust them that nobody's looking at anything without a search warrant. Get the fuck out of here. Like, it's the dumbest fucking thing ever. But circling back to it, you know, you make the point. So first of all, I learned recently, the United States has not formally declared war since World War II.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Every single military action since then has been an undeclared war, from Korea to Vietnam to Desert Storm 1 to Desert Storm 2 to the global war on terror. It's all undeclared in terms of declaring war. Yes, there's authorizations for
Right.
use of force. That's where you're trying to go about
Yes, and it's still fucking Congress's power.
it.
Regardless
Yeah.
if they say I declare war or like 1, 2, 3, 4,
Yeah.
it's some war. Like it is a congressional authorization of the use of force. No, there's nothing in the Constitution or anywhere for that matter that says you have to write, I declare some war. Like,
Yeah.
nobody, that doesn't fucking matter. The reality is that Congress authorized the use of military force against another sovereign nation, which is, by definition, in international law, the declaration of war. Like that is Jesse.
So there's a point I want to make here, though, which is the word dictator comes from the Latin, meaning he who speaks. And under the old law in Rome, when they recognized a military emergency, like to Jesse's point, they would give the dictator absolute power. So he could direct the economy, he could direct the troops and everything for a temporary and defined set of time. And so when he was done, they took that power back away. And so it's ironic that we have come to take dictator to mean absolute somebody who doesn't take power, who is entrenched. And, I say that to characterize it, to circle back to Jesse's point about there was valid reason sometimes for handing the president this kind of power. But the problem is the citizenry never takes those reins back.
Couple things I wanted to mention too, and I hope this maybe shed some light on the specific question you asked earlier, Bobby. What I think about when I think about the way that we've targeted ideology in different ways and how it's tied specifically to how we used it. If you look at what we do with Noriega, okay, he's got a long-standing relationship with U.S. intelligence, stops playing ball, he amasses a personal fortune through narcotics. We turn a blind eye. Then we actually go there and he surrenders and we bring him back and we try him in Miami. And then if you fast forward a little bit, what do we see? Something much more direct, but through the agency environment. So you got the CIA and the DEA working with the Mexican National Police, and they gun Escobar down on a rooftop in 1993. So then you see the progression of now we're all the way in wild territory where we're sending a strike group off the coast of somebody else's country and sending our premier counterterrorism force to capture the president. I mean, that's wild.
Well, let me be clear that at no point did I misunderstand the progression of the consolidation of executive power, and the way that this things play out. But right now they're saying I can call them a terrorist, and therefore I can invade another country. That is, now correct me if I'm wrong, quite a fucking leap.
But this is all
It's a
PR.
leap, but that's because they're not playing by the rules anymore.
Of course not.
But it's all PR, right? This is all just a sales job, right? This is all just how stuff gets sold to the American people, and during the first Desert Storm, a lot of military officials talked about how we're glad to have an all volunteer force. It makes us more efficient, blah, 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 blah. You know what else it does? It makes the populace more willing to accept military action because there's not this lottery where any young American could be called into the military and forced to serve. That's kind of what ended our involvement in Vietnam. Like everybody was like, I don't want to go. And people were being drafted and your friends were being drafted for an unpopular war. And that got the citizenry to the point where they were like, yeah, we don't support this. And when you break that chain and like, oh, everybody here's a volunteer, everybody at home is too busy watching The Simpsons.
Well, I want to point this out too, because a lot of people want to talk about oil, and there's a lot to talk about with oil. But what I think people are largely not talking about is the way in which this administration tried to use the Alien Enemies Act and then Alien Registration Act under the guise that the Venezuelan government was essentially invading us via Trinidad. Like, even since bringing Maduro back, they have used this in DOJ cases to support the use of the Alien Enemies Act. It is the fact that nobody is talking about the way in which this underscores their support for wielding emergency powers at will, war powers at will, is a bit disturbing. And also the way that nobody's talking about what the Alien Registration Act actually means for American citizens and the way that it was used in McCarthyism and the Red Scare to imprison people for essentially First Amendment rights. Now, I will say, as we talked about before, the First Amendment standard today is different than it was then. But when you look at the flag burning EO and the other things that are meant to spark litigation, that is meant to roll back First Amendment protections, it doesn't take much to put together the absolute fucking nightmare that will be for American citizens if they're successful. So I guess not to digress too far, but I'd love to hear y'all's thoughts on that.
I mean, it feeds right into what I was saying a minute ago, right? About the administrations create a compelling argument for why we need to give up our rights. And that is the moment we need to be digging up in our heels and saying, no, 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 no. There are no fucking exceptions. The Bill of Rights exists and we get to have it regardless. Like, it's not just because it's inconvenient for us to have rights right now because you've created this narrative about an invasion, which there's like a million ways that I have contempt for that, from the fact that, you know, a lot of the development of these gangs comes from American prison culture, and the fact that we incarcerate so many people, from the fact that the armament comes from our environment and our 2A community and the easy availability of guns in this country. There's like, from the fact that they were empowered by our appetite for drugs, the irony of the fact that during the time we had the quote war on drugs, the CIA was actively bringing in drugs in order to fund, you know,
Right.
rebels and like, you
And we
know,
do
right
save lots of other governments.
in South America.
But my question more is pointing towards the part that is not so much consent or revocation, is the power that the Supreme Court holds to roll back what things are protected under the First Amendment. It's the difference in a union office having pamphlets on communism and spending 20 years in prison, and what that would mean today. Logic in those cases were, well, in order to implement communism in the United States necessarily requires the violent or illegal overthrow of the United States government, and therefore we'll just assume, that was implied in your conversation. That wouldn't, under today's First Amendment standard, that wouldn't work. But people spent decades in prison, and it survived First Amendment litigation then. And so when you talk about, like I said, the flag burn EO, even right now, the birthright citizenship, all of us, we've had the conversation on that. But the reality is, the Supreme Court took the case. And I mean, where by all measures of today's society, that should have been an easy rejection, they took the case. And it was actually took up to the Supreme Court on a limited appeal, right? But now we are going to hear the United States Supreme Court decide whether or not, people born on American soil to parents who were not American citizens or, legal permanent residents, etc., are entitled to citizenship. That should have been cut and dry. But the reality is, it's not, apparently, right? And this administration is relying on that. And what they're relying on is doing shit they can't do, being sued, and having the completely corrupt, stacked court tell them again. So what does that mean? Let's say the flag burning EO is challenged. It goes up. The Supreme Court takes the case. They roll back First Amendment protection. And then we're right back to this conversation right here, puts us in prison.
Yeah, the stuff.
So
with the
anyway, that's it for disorderly. I'm sorry, just kidding.
Same, bro. If y'all have not looked at the Alien Registration Act, look at it. Look at it during the Red Scare. Look at it. Look at how many people did decades in prison. Look at the case law. Enjoy your weekend.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely wild. And I mean, on that point, McCarthyism, right? I mean, just absolutely wild, and fuels just all these things that turned out to be really bad for foreign policy for the United States, like Operation Ajax, for example.
Operation.
Jesse, do you have another point to jump to? Because if not, I'm going to ask a question.
No, go ahead.
Okay. So when we talk about, basically the industrial revolution, right? When we go to between World War I and World War II, and then what we see is the Great Depression, and we see the production of weapons, right, pulled the United States out of the Great Depression via the military-industrial complex, right? And what we see is war being profitable. And then we see the development of NATO and how basically war becomes business. And we all know how that went for us after 9/11. So a little bit, Joey, is to your point about the joint whatever. We see a lot of talk about today about we're funding the defense of everybody in NATO, but in reality, would you all agree that the United States did that for its own benefit? Like,
Don't get me started. The fact that the U.S. has been like the global policeman and has been the de facto force keeping open the shipping lanes around the world has benefited no country more than the United States of America. It is like that is the primary goal. That is a primary mechanism by which we have been able to exercise economic imperialism. At first, when we were making products that the world wanted, we could export. And then in the years since, that we could get cheap products from elsewhere in the world. It's how we exploit the difference in labor. It's how we get to exploit poor people in other countries without inconveniently having them in front of us to see how they're being exploited because we get cheap t-shirts at Walmart. This narrative about not paying their fair share always drives me insane because it's just so economically illiterate, historically illiterate, and obviously
geopolitically illiterate, and I'm sure, Jesse, that'll lead you right over to Greenland for us.
Yeah.
It's a double-digit IQ idea.
I just want to continue the conversation going. I want to provide a little bit extra context in terms of everything we've kind of covered so far already. And again, we can absolutely continue discussing this, but again, I just want to provide an overall general review so we kind of see the bigger picture of what's going on. It's that America has an addictive habit of getting involved in other people's affairs, more so than the average nation, which is so ironic because our foundation was literally the opposite. George Washington left his farewell address, which, by the way, I should mention, he originally wrote at the end of his first term, but decided not to publish it because everyone had implored him that he had to run again. His second term, George Washington's second term in the 1790s, was riddled with a lot of opposition because of the policy of assumption, the creation of a national bank, and particularly his stance on the French Revolution were very divisive. But the point I want to make here is that at the end of his second term, Hamilton helped him write his farewell address, where he specifically talks about the avoidance of getting involved in international and foreign affairs, and he highly advised against it. Partially because we were not able to, we didn't have the military to do so, but also because he knew that it would complicate American government and politics and probably aggregate power. I would argue George Washington saw this a long way off about aggregating power, and since then, I'm reading a report real quick that was released in 2023 by Congress. This is congress.gov. And according to congress.gov, it says here, this report lists hundreds of instances in which the United States has used its armed forces abroad in situations of military conflict or potential conflict or for other normal peacetime purposes. It says here, at a portion of the report here, it says the report is about instances, not official count of unique countries, but very strongly implies a very large share of the world has seen U.S. military activity at some point. Cold War alone, covert regime change attempts. Number about 64 attempts by the U.S. government between 1947 and 1989.
Okay, I would argue that white people have an addiction to getting their nose in businesses. And there's white people like to control anybody that they, have convinced themselves or have been convinced or, subservient to them. And that's just the reality. You can't bird wash. You can't get Skittles. You can't play with a toy pew pew. You cannot jog. You can't even be in your own house. You can't go home to your own house without getting shot, right? You can't be in your own living room without getting shot. White people have an addictive issue. Now, when you talk about on an international level, let's be realistic about who is considered a sovereign nation, who isn't, what those power structures look like, who recognizes sovereignty and who doesn't. I mean, I think what you see is really an intricate weaving of colonialism, imperialism, and white supremacy. And I don't think that's news to anybody here on this panel. But I think that you have to look at what countries and who basically white folks consider legitimate and who they don't. I mean,
And
he
it
was
comes,
an illegitimate leader. Okay, well, guess what? If I right now decide that Trump is, you okay with Canada come down here and throwing some fucking soup for their family at his ass? Probably not. You know,
it comes down to, do they protect Western capital or not? Like
comes
one
down to
thing
white
that occurred,
supremacy, but yeah,
well, I mean, those are intrinsically linked, right? It's like the South, the antebellum South was perfect capitalism, right? Where like the white planter class got all of the benefits and they'd driven their labor costs to almost zero. And so, their inputs were so low and all of the benefits accrued to a very small select group of people who owned the stuff, hence capitalism. And white supremacy and capitalism are intrinsically linked in that sense. A couple of things that occur to me, that only just now occurred to me, is talk about the 1890s and 1900s. This is like kind of the sunsetting of the British Empire. And I think on the world stage, a lot of what was happening is the US was just slipping into the space left by Britain. And then, of course, World War I came along and really dealt a harsh blow to Britain's ability to project imperial power. And the US stepped in there. And of course, the World War II cemented that. I do want to, and it's only because I'm triggered, is like, this narrative about World War II pulled us out of the Great Depression is actually false. If you look at the economic data, the Great Depression extended through the end of World War II. What created us and pulled us out of World War II was the return of the servicemen back home and the economic output of having so many people contribute to the workforce who got all sorts of stimulus in the form of the GI Bill and who got all sorts of other support from the government, all of which was stimulated to the working class, as well as not all women who had joined in and become part of the working class while the men were off to war went back home. So you literally just had more people helping to build the barn, which is inevitably going to make the barn go up faster. So, I just like to make that point because it's
definitely correct me when I'm wrong. But Jesse, don't you sit up there and you didn't correct me when I said it, motherfucker.
Yeah. And so, again, for me, through the lens that I look at when I think about this, is all of these wars are wars by capital on the working class. Part of the reason why the Bolshevik Revolution scared Europe so much is because the asset class were seeing what was happening in Russia. And the entire point was to have a workers' revolution everywhere. And like, if not for the Kaiser, Germany looked like it might be happening there as well, because the war was unpopular with a lot of the German populace. And, the Russians even expected that the Germans would join them next. And if you get the Russians and the Germans, then domino effect through Europe. This is not an argument about whether communism is a good system or actually protects the worker or is a successful. I just don't want to get there. But in terms of how capital views the working class, like all of this, from our intervention in, Bolivia, which was the overthrowing, at the behest of the United Fruit Company. Why did that happen? Because they got a populist leader got elected who wanted to look out for the people and said, no, our resources are for us. So we're going to nationalize the assets of the fruit company. We're going to take the land back that you own. And it's like almost every bit of the narrative from Bolivia is the exact same thing we see in Venezuela about, some big, large U.S. corporate interests have had stuff taken away from them. Boo-hoo. We need to go in and expend military force to fix that. And we see the same thing over and over and over again. We haven't talked about Grenada. Grenada was the same thing. Like there's this narrative about protecting U.S. medical students. In point of fact is because they elected a populist leader who is flirting with socialism. Anytime you get a leader and a government that's willing to look out for the working class and do something for the people, saying you're likely to find a U.S. warship and a carrier group parked off your shore. It was the same thing in Venezuela when Chavez came in. And Chavez was very obviously pugnacious and had a lot of shit to say and probably shouldn't have been such a shit talker, and people like to point to the failure of Venezuela as a failure of socialism and conveniently disregard the crippling sanctions that were placed upon them. And at every step, Western capitalism has tried to strangle any power coming to the working class.
I've got to hear all of your thoughts on Burkina Faso.
I actually don't claim to know much about there. I imagine it's the same story. It wouldn't surprise me if it's the same story.
I am optimistic, anxious, I guess, right? Like Ibrahim Traore he seems, for all intents and purposes, like the next big good thing. It's working so far. It seems to be working. Burkina Faso's economy is up, it's growing. I'm not too familiar if he's consolidated power. Like, I don't know the very specifics of the politics. I'm very hopeful. I'm very optimistic. It's just sometimes these things turn sour. Oftentimes these things turn sour. So I'm very reserved in shooting out my praises, because so far I'm a big fan, but like I'm really nervous is the best I could say.
Love to see one of these experiments be allowed to play it out without Western interference.
Without Western intervention. Now, that's what I was going to say. I mean, and that's the question, right? I mean, so you make an interesting point here, and I'll raise the question: chicken or the egg, right? Do these experiments turn sour because of Western intervention, right? Do they consolidate power as a byproduct of necessity because we're meddling in a clandestine way? I mean, I don't know, 64 attempted overthrows between the 40s and the
You
80s.
tell us.
Yeah, no, I would say, I mean, I'm asking. It's more rhetorical than anything, and I think one of these experiments has the best opportunities to succeed on the continent of Africa, right? Especially if it's not the Congo, because the DRC has tantalum. So that's the story for a rainy day.
I think power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's like what we see in El Salvador with Bukele, what we saw in Tibet with, I can't remember her name, but like what we saw in Myanmar. There's a lot of populist leaders that come to power, promising stuff to the people. And I think it's inevitable, right? If you've got somebody who has that effort of will, who has that will to power, if you will, who has legitimate reasons why they should be in power because they're looking out for people. Well, they're like fucking Kobe. It's like, I know how hard I worked and I saw you showed up to the gym later, so I'm going to take the shot.
You want to shoot with me in the gym to say
Yeah.
right.
Like the willingness, I mean, which again, circling all the way back, makes Washington's, actions kind of so revolutionary to actually give up power voluntarily.
The reason why I asked about Burkina Faso is because of his particular dislike and disdain for an expulsion of Western influence, right? There's speeches that tell him, don't you bring me a plow, you don't fatten a goose, or I think you call it a goose. You bring me the ability to grow and repeat and be successful. So, and of course I'm paraphrasing the reason why I asked about that question. About y'all's views, because regardless of whether or not ego or corruption or whatever ends up a bit, playing into it, is sort of the objective rejection of Western influence that was really sort of piqued my interest. So we'll see, of course, how it goes.
I mean, just as a sidebar, Jesse mentioned King Leopold and the massacre of 10 million Africans in pursuit of rubber. Right there, like there's Western cultural imperialism, right? Why? Hitler is the ultimate villain in history for exterminating, 8 million European Jews, which is horrible, of course. But most Americans haven't even heard of King Leopold, and that's just, again, part of the ongoing valuing of, European folks over folks from the other parts of the planet.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think another point I want to make is the world is forever shifted by American imperialism. Like there's no denying it. And there's so many layers and aspects to it, from the propaganda here at home to the effects that it has in the countries that we interfere and meddle in, the responses of the native people of those lands, how they respond, whether in favor or against. And I think generally we need to be honest with ourselves that, especially after World War II intervention, what we see a lot is radical groups really start to pop up. Right? When we destabilize regions, when we disband their government and their parties, whether out of legitimate justification or not, tends to come bite us in the ass, right? We've done it with Al Qaeda, it's happened with the Taliban. And I think it's, now that we're doing this in Venezuela, I'm very, very apprehensive, I guess, very nervous and anxious about what this means for the Venezuelan people. Am I glad that Maduro's gone? Yeah. I mean, the guy's obviously a piece of shit. He's a dictator, right? But I think there's a right way and a wrong way to go about these things. And one, I don't trust this administration to do anything right, first off. It wasn't altruistic. We're not going to sit here and pretend like Trump invaded out of the kind of his heart to liberate the Venezuelan people from dictatorship. Because if that's the case, we got 47 other countries to get to liberate people from dictatorships and authoritarian regimes, including the United States. So, I don't know. I think overall, when I look at this, I don't see a I don't see a quick path out of this. I think we're going to be in Venezuela for a very long time, is the way I see it. Historically speaking, that's how it happens. When we get entangled in something, we tend to stay in there for quite some time. We've done it in Latin America. We did it to Vietnam. We did it to Iraq. We did it to Afghanistan. Now we're in Venezuela. We're going to be here for a while.
And
if
lost
Trump
all of
wants
them.
yeah, right. If Trump wants to continue this imperialistic, jingoistic behavior with Greenland and other parts of, other sovereign territories, it's going to be a big problem, especially when it comes to NATO. That's going to be, I would argue,
Quite literally, what a conundrum that a NATO country will literally be the invocation of Article
right.
5.
And I don't want to sit here and ruminate the idea that Trump would actually militarily invade Greenland. I would like to think he's not that dumb.
He is a useful idiot.
Yeah, it's also like we also don't know the limits of his human stupidity, as Einstein said. Right? Einstein said there are two things in the world, in the universe, in existence rather, that are infinite. That's the universe and human stupidity. And I'm not sure about the universe yet. So I will say, I guess, is the answer.
Much ink has been spilled about the parallels between the U.S. now and Germany then. But what concerns me is nobody stopped him. Hitler, right? And every time he didn't get stopped, he emboldened him for the next one. Chamberlain shows up. Okay, really? That's it? That's all you're going to take, right? We're done. We're good. Okay. And clearly that didn't work. And, I used to be much more sanguine about the idea, like nobody's dumb enough to invade Greenland. And now I'm like, he might be dumb enough. And, I think part of it is, and you saw this during the initial invasion of Iraq as well, is you've got a bunch of, there's a government by incompetence. It was not nearly as bad then as it is now. But you got people who were raised in, our society is one of the most violent societies on the planet. We are raised in an environment to romanticize and glorify violence. And I think there's a lot of people in the administration who do think it's just as simple as we're the biggest army on the planet. Nobody can fuck with us. We can do whatever the hell we want. And, I think the chance of, it's like those memes that you say, the chances of being attacked by an evil penguin are very low, but not zero.
And yet there are evil penguins everywhere. I can tell you right now, the groups that are the architects of what's happening right now have thrown all their chips on the table and they are going for broke. I would not underestimate my opponent.
In one of those weird fucking quirks of history, I think the Epstein files play into this too. I think the desperation to try to keep pushing that off the front page, it plays into this. And it's one of those, and I'm sure, Jesse, you can name many more, where it's like these weird little side things in history. Like there was something, I want to say is before World War I or late 80s, there's a French thing, like a French officer, and there was these forged papers about somebody being a collaborator. I wish I could remember.
The Epstein files plays into this, and the fact that they are, in my opinion, and honestly, on good information. I do believe the reason why there's not a backbone to be fucking had.
That's
across
true.
Congress.
Because the capital class looks out for each other. I mean, fucking David Brooks, New York Times editorial, like, we should really move on from this. This is not important. And then the next week a picture comes out, him sitting at a table with Epstein. It's like, okay, that's why I bought a pitchfork.
The reality is that some people are always looking for the next thing, right? And when the next thing when there's no more money or the next amount of money or position power or whatever it offers no more tangible benefit, these people have nothing left but to play God. And I think you see it over and over again in many of these situations. And I think that both sides are probably complicit in this, and it is the reason why you're watching people literally give our republic away in front of our face. And the idea that we rely on a check or balance that was laid out in the Constitution is gone. The American people will and have and will continue to every day, but must find their feet. There is no other fallback.
Yeah. I'd like to do two things really quick. I'd like to, in classic fashion, offer some books, and I would like to have our final comments be pointed at a question I'd like to pose. So first off, there is a lot of fucking books about this topic, and I recommend people please go out and find them and read them. Some great authors about this are Daniel Immerwahr. He's the one that Fingers had mentioned earlier, How to Hide an Empire. Absolutely amazing. I actually recommend Chalmers Johnson. I can't even say his name. Chalmers Johnson writes a few books about the American empire and its decline. Noam Chomsky, too, actually writes a lot about this as well. There is a lot of books about American imperialism, about American empire, both historically and in the modern sense as well. Just literally go to Amazon and Google American Empire books, and you're going to get highly recommend picking up any one of them and reading them to really get a sense of what we're talking about. Some really good ones. I don't know if anybody else has any recommendations, but I would like to pose my final question to close out and to see what you guys think. So let me pose my question and have you guys answer, and then we'll close the podcast. It's no secret that the world is gearing up for war. We know this. Germany and Japan, for the first time since World War II, are pouring billions of dollars into establishing standing armies with technology, tanks, planes, and everything in between. Germany just last year approved a 100 billion euro project to modernize their military to be the largest standing military on the European continent by 2029. That's 3 years away, is what they're looking at. Currently, they have over 150,000 troops. They're looking to expand it to 250,000, and then next year, probably double that, probably again. The world is gearing up for war. Tensions are high. The Global Peace Index of 2025 actually found that it was the 13th time in 17 years that a 23 metric report reports that the Global Peace Index hit a new low consecutively. Things are getting heated up. So my question is, in light of the revival of American jingoism and imperialism under this administration, how do you see the future of the world in countries respond to this type of behavior?
I can
It's a
go.
big question. I think that we will see unexpected alliances. I think right now we're seeing, some folks say we're not sharing intel with you anymore, right? And the hubris that the United States have because of our military success historically is, well, we don't need you, right? And you can only do that so much. These oceans will only save you for so long. I would say, and sometimes we weren't even fighting the whole world by ourselves, like we seem to be gearing up for now, and we still almost lost midway. So I don't know. I think we need to be very careful.
I think about the lesson of my international affairs class when I was in college. And it talked about the most dangerous times in history are when a hegemon falls. When a country that has been basically exerting military force to keep everybody else in line falls. Energies are unleashed that are unpredictable, uncontrollable. In some respect, I don't feel like I can peer into the future and give concrete answers other than a lot of death and destruction, a lot of violence. I think for too long has relied upon their oceans to protect them and thinks that their oceans will continue to protect them. But I don't think that's necessarily true any longer. I think we can end, especially not if they're trying to do authoritarian things at home, right? Like the number of military that we have, it's like you're going to have to, if you want to really, people are so afraid of martial law and everything, and trying to bring the military back to U.S. shores to enforce anything like that while still maintaining and projecting force outwards. I think it was the Austrian defense minister just said, hey, you try to take Greenland, you instantly lose every base in Europe. You lose bases everywhere. Like, you just get blind. And, it hadn't considered to me that the fall of the hegemon could be self-inflicted to this degree, right? Where it's just like, hey, let's just take this incredibly easy thing I've been handed and just fuck it all up. And, people want to say Russia was a hoax. If you read Collusion, it's not a hoax. People went to jail behind that shit. Like, all of the people who claim it's a hoax are just fucking uninformed. And whether he's a conscious agent or just a fucking unwitting dupe that somehow managed to fail upwards to the point where Putin has been able to slide him on like a glove, like, who benefits? It's pretty fucking obvious. It's like Russia benefits and China really benefits. And I think that's the thing that really gets me is seeing China and seeing all of the technological advances there and seeing all of the things that they have in China that we don't have here. And it's like 15 years ago, we were talking about how, oh, China's just trying to like pull people out of poverty and like they don't even have the infrastructure in their economy, yada, 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 yada. And I think when I look at China, I think the same way I think people would have looked at the United States in the early part of, the 1900s, especially like the interwar period about, new technologies being invented and like just a society that seems vibrant and seems to have like is ready to step onto the world stage. And I think it doesn't take a strategic genius to sit back and go, well, shit, if the US is just going to blow its own feet off and then Europe's going to like arm, and we've already seen what the fucking happens. We've seen this movie twice. What happens when you have a heavily armed Germany on the European continent? China can probably sit back and go, all we have to do is wait. And then once everything falls apart, we can step into that vacuum and we can become the hegemon. We can do the exact same thing the US did. The US basically became the global policeman because we were the one left standing. Like our homeland were not destroyed. Our economies were not destroyed the way every other major powers was around the planet. So we became the global policeman, not by merit, not by exceptionalism, but basically because of that buffer space allowed us to be, okay, we'll step in because we're the ones who can step in. We're the ones who have the ability to step in. And, then that economic growth that we talk about allowed us to accelerate that difference. It allowed us to really step into a leadership role with NATO and really like cement our control of everything. And looking into the future, 15, 20 years, I can totally see that exact thing happening in China stepping into that vacuum. I'm not a foreign affairs expert. That's just a future that I could see. In terms of books, I'm going to offer one, The Devil's Chessboard, which is a book about the Dulles brothers and the influence they exerted over U.S. foreign policy. And one of them was at the State Department. I can't remember which one, Alan Dulles and his brother. Dulles Airport in DC is named after one of them. But these two were very, very instrumental in driving a lot of these same interventions, very, very instrumental in creating the idea of an interventionist modern America, very, very instrumental in like leading up to the Bay of Pigs, which was basically an attempt to bring JFK to heel because they really thought like if they created this thing and pushed JFK, he would have no choice but to okay air support. And then they would have demonstrated, they would have sucked him into their web and that, they would have him under their thumb. Anyway, recommend the book. So that's a lengthy diatribe, but that's my thoughts.
I'm sorry, just one quick other thing on Dulles Brothers. They're also the ones that basically convinced the president to participate with Britain in Operation Ajax. In fact, sorry, go ahead, Bobby.
Think, like every mediocre white man, this regime has overplayed their hand and underestimated their enemy. And the rest of the world is looking to see what our move is, and they will make their move based on that. And you see realliances forming immediately. Not even necessarily realliances, right? But the assessing of strengths and weaknesses and the shoring up of those things. And the world's eyes are on the American people right now. And it's our fucking move.
Yeah, no, I agree. To kind of take from what you guys said, I'm going to build upon that. When I think of this question, how will the world react? What does the future look like with this, rejuvenation of American jingoism? And I see a few things. We said new alliances, 100%. We already see it right now. New alliances are forming, which will lead to new economic systems. And these economic systems will wean off of the United States.
They will shit on the American people at the first need. At the first
Yep.
need. So
And
it's your move, America.
And when I think about this, I am reminded of the British Empire. And the British Empire had a slow decline. It is, I call it the declining pains of empire, right? And what we see with Britain is that as they continue to lose power, they were riddled with scandal. They were riddled with infighting, riddled with wars all across the globe they had to contend with. And it wasn't just the American Revolution. They fought multiple wars in Africa and in Asia to maintain dominance. I think this is if the United States goes the path that I think they're going to go, that I'm guessing they're going to go, we have a very, very rough road ahead of us of American dominant decline with infighting, wars, strife, economic depressions, and everything in between. I think it is going to force America to face the ghosts of its past. It's going to be a time of reckoning, and it's going to be a time that will test the American spirit and resilience of our government and experiment to see, will America decline and remain like the British did, or will it disappear and fragment like the Roman Empire?
One thing to add on to that. It's almost like when you have multiple suspects in an interrogation, with the fractures, you can watch them crack, right? You see who's going to turn, what little push makes it happen. And you see that happening. It's the fray of desperation. And when we talk about what America's next choice is, what the opportunity here is, it is the opportunity to categorically reject white supremacy that has rotted our nation and this world from the inside out. And there will be no course correction without motherfucking correcting it. And that's where we're at right now. And so, quite frankly, there's absolutely a choice to be made. And I want to be clear when we talk about the Holocaust. The absolute genocide of Jews was 8 to 9 million, right? The total death toll was somewhere around 80 million people. Soldiers, famine, disease, genocide, warfare, you name it. Even the slightest internal conflict in the United States will result in the absolute abject suffering of millions across this globe. So when we talk about who are the heroes of society, I mean, the conversations that we've had, and I think it was Jesse who said, if everybody does their part, nobody has to be a hero. Quite literally, the world is looking at us, and for us to sit over here and purport to be leaders and the best at anything when we've been the best at mostly nothing except causing suffering and death around the world. Let's change that story. It is literally on us. We are all a link in the chain of what comes next across the globe.
What you are doing. Sorry, go ahead.
No. This is that in a lot of the organizing circles, I see people, sort of to some degree getting dejected, talking about crying. I'm in a lawyer group and they talk about crying in court. And I was like, cry in court. Cry in court, fight air, cry, because it's normal. And you should not normalize it. And nobody should make you feel like it's normal. Like once we lose our humanity, we've already lost. And the reality is, cry. It's not normal. None of this is normal. We are in quite literally some of the most unprecedented times in history. And when you're done, wake up the next day, resolved, and put your fucking war paint back on, because it's you, it's me, it's all four of these boxes, and it's anybody that's listening. And it is quite literally every day right now is where we make the decisions that nobody has to be a hero.
What you're doing now is what you would have done in the Jim Crow South. What you're doing now is what you would have done in Europe when the Jews were being oppressed. What you're doing now is what you would have done in the 60s during the civil rights movement and the tension in the South.
What will happen to the American empire? I guess is a real question, right? But we'll see. The answer is we'll see. Will we splinter? Will we decline and remain? Will we change like the Romans did from a republic to a more of a dictatorship kind of thing, right?
Empire, yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's just some really big topics that we are discussing, obviously, but I think the listener should really contend with and think about, because it matters. This matters. This dictates the future, literally, of the globe. How we see this in what we do next, how we respond, and how we act. So I want to thank everyone for listening. I think we're going to wrap up. It's been almost an hour and a half, at least for the recording time. I don't know about the editing time, but thank you everyone for listening. Thank you for joining. We will continue to release podcasts weekly, and we shall be back with more episodes as things progress. Thank you all, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Disorderly Conduct Podcast, a production of the Public Integrity Network. We believe that the first step to taking back our democracy is getting money out of politics. Come find us at moneyoutofpolitics.org and we'll put you to work. In the meantime, get involved in your community. Volunteer at a soup kitchen. Start a rideshare service. Go to school board meetings. Anything you can to make sure this government remembers that their powers derive from the consent of the governed.